Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting in 2026 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. I remind all members and witnesses to ensure their devices are on silent. Megan Gallagher is joining us remotely this morning. The first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take items 9 and 10 in private. Are we agreed? Agreed, thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence on the draft council tax variation for unoccupied dwellings, Scotland Amendment Regulations 2026, and we're joined by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government, Shona Robson, MSP, who's accompanied by officials James Macis, Local Taxation Policy Team Leader, Fiona Hepburn, who's the Empty Homes Policy Manager, and Susan Robb, who is a solicitor. And I welcome you all to the meeting. This instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve it before it comes into force. And following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider a motion to approve the instrument. And I remind everyone that Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate on the instrument that follows. And there's no need to turn your microphones on or off. We'll do that for you. And I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement.
Well, good morning, Convener, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to these draft regulations. So this policy was first explored in partnership with local government through the Joint Working Group on Council Tax Reform in keeping with the spirit of the Very House Agreement. That work was informed by the joint public consultation on the council tax treatment of second homes and long-term empty homes, which sought views on increasing flexibility for councils, and it received significant engagement from stakeholders and members of the public. Together, that engagement recognised that decisions about local taxation and housing pressures should be informed by collaboration and evidence, where ultimately respecting the democratic accountability of local authorities. The regulations before Parliament deliver on a key priority of this government to deliver a fairer housing and taxation system. These regulations give effect to powers created by the Housing Scotland Act 2025. That Act amended the legislative framework governing council tax variation for unoccupied dwellings and provided the opportunity to remove the previous statutory cap on the level of premium that local authorities may apply to second homes and long-term empty homes. The regulations being considered today have two principal objectives. First, they establish and maintain a national default premium of 100% for second homes and long-term empty homes. Second, they remove the previous statutory cap and empower councils to determine the appropriate premium in their own area, whether that is to apply the 100% default, increase it above that level, reduce it, apply no premium at all, or offer a discount. In doing so, they place decisions about the balance of housing use firmly in the hands of councils, who are best placed to assess their own housing markets and community circumstances. Further, the Housing Scotland Act 2025 enables Scottish ministers to issue statutory guidance, which local authorities must have regard to. Guidance is currently being agreed between the Scottish Government and COSLA. This will aim to support consistency of approach, ensures proportionality, and highlights circumstances where applying a premium may not advance the policy intent. It's important to emphasise that this is an enabling instrument. It does not mandate any increase in council tax. Any decision to vary the premium rests with individual local authorities, which are democratically elected and accountable to their own communities. Housing markets differ significantly across Scotland. The presence and impact of second homes and long-term empty homes varies between urban, rural and island communities. In some areas, high levels of unoccupied dwellings can affect housing availability for permanent residents and place pressure on local supply. In others, local dynamics may differ. These regulations recognise that local authorities are best placed to assess their own housing pressures, affordability challenges and sustainability considerations. These changes put councils front and centre in determining how council tax can support the effective use of housing stock in their area. Alongside that flexibility, important safeguards remain in place. Existing statutory exemptions and discounts are unaffected by these regulations. In addition, guidance will make clear that councils should act proportionately and in line with the purpose of the legislation, including in circumstances where a dwelling is unoccupied because the liable person is required to live away from home because of their employment in the armed forces or health care. The intention is to ensure that greater local flexibility is balanced with fairness and recognition of legitimate circumstances. In summary, these regulations deliver on the powers created by the Housing Scotland Act 2025 to remove constraints, maintain a clear national framework and trust local authorities to make accountable decisions about how council tax supports housing policy in their communities. They're enabling, proportionate and grounded in earlier partnership work with local government. Thanks.
Agreement is working and there's a lot of collaboration happening there. I'm going to start off with a general question and kind of getting maybe a bit of the kind of context within which this regulation is coming in. So since 2013, we've had a situation where councils have been able to charge 100% premium on long-term empty homes. And then from April 2024, we had 100% premium on second homes. And now we've got this regulation coming forward. But I'd be interested to get a sense if the Scottish Government has an understanding of the picture of the impact on that premium on second homes since 2024. Has that actually had an impact on reducing second homes? I mean, I know 2024 is not that long ago, but I just wondered if you've got a picture of that.
Well, I can share some figures with you around over a period of time. So in 2012, the number of second homes peaked at 40,599. And then between 2019 and 2023, the number of second homes remained stable and then dropped by 10% in 2024. And that was the biggest annual decrease in 10 years. The decrease between 23 and 24 is likely related to the 100% council tax premium on second homes that came into effect in April 2024. And that was followed by a decrease of 3% between 2024 and 2025. So there is some evidence that it has had an impact. But again, I think it's important to monitor. Maybe just James, I think we will be monitoring the situation on the use of these powers by local authorities in terms of the impact.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're in regular communication with local authorities through the Institute for Revenue Rating and Valuation. Yeah, we get regular updates on how individual local authorities feel things are going on the ground.
Evelyn, that kind of connects into the question you were going to ask. Do you want to go any further with that?
I mean, I don't know if you want to say any more. You've kind of alluded to the fact about how the impact will be monitored. Can you say anything about how that's done?
Well, it will be done through the intel being provided by local authorities, given that this is empowering them to essentially take local decisions according to their local housing markets and local policy. Each local authority will potentially go down a different route if they go down a route at all. So it is entirely up to them, but we would then want to monitor the impact of a particular policy by a particular local authority. The financial memorandum that is provided essentially took an estimate that if every council applied 100% premium across second homes and long-term empty homes, and there's a figure that could raise between 50 and 70 million, but of course each local authority may not do that, and then there could be variation between local authorities, and also that assumes full uptake and no behavioural change. So we will have to, in real time, monitor the impact, and we will get a picture then of different policies applied across local authorities, and we'll be able to look at the success and impact of those policies and that policy variation across 32 local authorities. James, anything to?
Yes, certainly. So as the Cabinet Secretary mentioned there, so we collect aggregate data as well, so we'll get an aggregate picture of the total number of second homes, long-term empty homes. But as well, one of the things we're going to look to do is work with specific local authorities because we were curious to see, you know, what's beneath the bonnet, kind of track the individual journey maybe of a couple of properties to see what happens. But that will be sort of quite localised and with specific local authorities rather than presenting a sort of aggregate Scotland-wide picture. As the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, it's a discretionary policy, so you'd likely see a lot of local variation.
Okay, that's me. Can you?
Just before I bring in Alexander Stewart, just on that monitoring, but kind of also looking at that decrease, that 10% drop in 2024 for these regulations came in. Do we know, I mean, part of the point of this is to actually create more housing supply for people. Do we know if those second homes are moving in into, are they becoming homes for people? I think that's what we're trying to do. Are we looking at that? And here that you're going to be monitoring going forward some very specific ones, but of that 10% drop in 2024, do we know that they actually became homes or what happened to them?
Level of information collected through the empty homes officers, I think that's the correct term for them, in terms of the work they're doing in local authorities. There is information around the reclassification for council tax purposes of a number of homes, and so that information will be there to some extent, but I think over time it will be important to track whether these regulations have a further impact beyond what's already there.
Or do you want to come in?
Thank you, thank you, Convener. Given the powers are due to come into effect on the 1st of April, can I ask when the Scottish Government anticipates publishing the guidance on these?
When do we intend to publish the guidance?
So they'll be agreed with COSLA, cleared by COSLA leaders, and then subsequently published if the instrument is approved.
I should also say that it will be possible for local authorities to introduce this change in year if they so wish. So it's not a case of if they don't introduce, because of the overlap, they can. Obviously, it would be difficult for them to have this in place for the start of the year, given the timing of the housing legislation and then the regulations. But it can be introduced in year if local authorities so wish.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And now we're going to move into unintended consequences. I'm going to bring in Mark Griffin.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Good morning.
Morning.
I support these regulations. I think they're absolutely the right thing to do, especially in the context of the housing emergency. I just wanted to touch on two areas where I hope wouldn't have an impact on the success of these. And the first one was on whether an increase in council tax on second homes then produces an incentive for owners to switch to short-term lets rather than paying that second home levy. And I just wonder what thinking the government has done around the enforcement of that at a council level, whether that is then followed up through the short-term licensing scheme, and also ensuring there's proper enforcement that if they are switched to short-term lets, that they are available for let for the 140-day period that they have to be, that they are occupied for the 70-day period that they need to be to qualify for the small business bonus scheme, so that this switch to a short-term let isn't really used as a tax avoidance method. Yeah.
No, absolutely, and we would expect those that to be enforced in terms of ensuring that everyone that is operating a short-term let are operating with a licence, and I can say that the first unlicensed short-term let operator has been convicted and fined, and we understand other cases are being taken forward through the courts. So I think that would send out a message that if you convert your property into short-term let, you must then abide by the rules around that, and that is what we would expect. I would hope that what we would see is a number of properties being brought into long-term letting arrangements. Again, we can't. It's up to the individuals to decide what they do with their property ultimately. But what we can do is to incentivise and disincentivise certain actions. And what we would like to see clearly is more properties being brought into long-term rental use. I don't know, James, is there anything else you want to?
So you're quite right, Cabinet Secretary, and you alluded to the 140 days of an intention to let, but as well there's a sort of 70 nights actually let criteria as well, and there are information notices sent out by Scottish assessors to determine whether this criteria has actually been met, and so for a second home, so to speak, to become a self-catering property, it needs to meet that threshold. It needs to meet that criteria, and the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned as well the licence regime and the powers associated with that also are available to local authorities.
And it was, of course, the Barclay review that brought in they had identified this as a loophole in there. Therefore, that is why the requirements for the actual minimum lets was brought in to avoid that being the case.
Okay, and do you have any indication of that 10% drop in 2024? Is there any indication of the numbers which switched to short-term let?
We can look to see whether we can provide that, James. I mean, I don't have that information in front of me, but we can see whether we can. It may be here, but unless anybody has it to hand, we can.
So certainly, I mentioned earlier the sort of working with some local authorities to understand what's happening beneath those aggregate figures and to sort of follow the journey of some properties to sort of understand, what happens to them after they, if they move away from second home classification. And so we hope that will sort of uncover some more information. We'd be looking to do it with a local authority area like Argyll and Bute, which has a sort of higher proportion of both, and so would provide some really strong indications of what the trends might be.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that. My second question was on the council tax premiums for long-term empty homes. And just a concern that potentially the higher premiums maybe affect an owner's ability to invest in the property to actually bring it back into a livable standard, and just wonder what discussions have gone on with local authorities as to areas of flexibility which could allow for a property which is actively being renovated and brought back into use, because I know certainly empty homes officers in North Lanarkshire will work closely with an owner who's working to bring a property into use. They'll recommend contractors to do the work, and I wonder if that was an area of discussion that's happened.
Yeah, my understanding, and I'm just trying to find it here, is that there is a period of grace, if you like, for things like repairs and redecoration. I think it's 6 months. Is that correct? Absolutely. So if someone is in the position of upgrading a property, they'll have a 6 month grace period from the premium.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm now going to bring in Willie Coffey with a very wonderful theme of fairness.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and your colleagues. It's good to hear the extent of the collaboration that you had with COSLA on this proposal and the flexibilities that are clearly being introduced. But one of the issues that kept cropping up during our consideration of this was that, in principle, do we think this is a fair thing to do, to introduce a high premium for a second home, perhaps when people who have done this have probably already paid significantly towards things like land and buildings transaction tax and so on to get the property. So I'd appreciate a comment from yourself, Cabinet Secretary, about the kind of principle about fairness about this and whether it's applicable and fair and so on.
Well, I think it is fair, and also a number of safeguards are built in. So I mentioned some of those in my opening statement, but ensuring that existing statutory exemptions and discounts remain in place. You know, so, for example, where a property is empty because someone's in hospital or receiving care, that the exemption continues to apply. There's also a mandatory 50% discount for job-related dwellings and purpose-built holiday homes. That's unchanged. As I said, there was a 6-month grace period for new owners where repairs or renovations are being undertaken. And, you know, the statutory guidance, councils have to have regard when they're exercising these powers to be able to take into account things like where a property is unoccupied because the person's serving in the armed forces or deployed away from home, working in the health service. So I think there are a lot of safeguards there, but ultimately, you know, Parliament has decided rightly to, after all representations and issues being raised, I think on a cross-party basis for some time, about the issue of, particularly in some areas, the loss of property to second homes and the number of empty homes that are sitting there that could be brought back into use when people are desperate for rental properties in areas where they want to remain living. So this is all about balance, but I do think it is right to have a policy objective of trying to do something about that. But that all has to be done in a proportionate way, and that is why I think the local powers for individual local authorities to make those decisions is right, because what would work in your area and, you know, and what the issues are in your area will be quite different from what may be the issue in the Highland and Islands, where there has been a high loss of properties to second homes. I think that's why it's right to empower local authorities to do the right thing in their area.
Okay, thank you. And that process, would that come about by way of an appeal? For example, if a person found that the local authority was asking for 200%, for example, on that, and they chose to disagree with that, so that's an appeal process that we would be involved in then, wouldn't it?
Well, the guidance will be clear that councils, you know, have to consider proportionality and fairness in individual circumstances. So, you know, there will be clearly criteria in the guidance of what that may relate to. You know, the statutory guidance will be critical here to ensure that people are, you know, treated fairly and that the circumstances are taken into account. James, I don't know if you want to add.
Certainly. So, as the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, these regulations give councils the flexibility to respond to the impact of second and long-term empty homes in their area. Now, the legislation that provides the basis for these regulations also allows Scottish ministers to set a limit on the premium, but only if there is evidence that the premium was becoming disproportionately large in such a way that it would contravene an occupier's human rights.
Okay. That doesn't sound like an appeal process to me, though.
So there is an appeals process for all council tax bills. So the local tax chamber
Standard
would be
appeal.
Yes, a standard appeal. I think the point James is making is that on a council-wide basis, if a council is, I mean, maybe too pejorative, but if it looks as if they may be misusing the premium or it's having unintended consequences that, you know, but the council isn't recognised. I don't foresee that happening because it would be counterproductive. But I think on an individual basis, the normal appeals mechanisms will be there. Plus, the guidance will set out the specifics where there should be an understanding. I mentioned the armed forces, people working in, you know, health services, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thanks for that. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. And now we're going to move on to the role of local authorities, and I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher, who's joining us online.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and officials. We've already touched upon the premiums, so I won't go back into questions on that. But the committee did hear last week that a number of circumstances in rural areas where properties might need to be left empty for periods. And one of the examples that was given was operational rural accommodation linked to estate operations. So I'm looking for more information from the Cabinet Secretary on whether the Scottish Government will provide guidance for local authorities to help ensure consistency and how those properties are treated.
I'll bring Fiona in a second, but I think this is why the guidance will be really important, because it will need to look at and be flexible enough to take into account local circumstances. So I think what you're referring to are things like seasonal workers, where the properties will be used, but they'll be used at certain times of the year. And I would expect the guidance would enable that flexibility. But Fiona, do you want to?
Yeah. So this is obviously why there is discretion that's baked into this policy. And if we look at the fact that the premium's been in place on long-term empty at 100% since 2013, we have seen over a long period of time that discretion is working a lot better. So at the time of the parliamentary inquiry back in 2019 and 2020, we did have a number of local authorities where we received still information that discretion wasn't quite working. Having been in post all of this time, I can see that those complaints have dropped dramatically. So local authorities have and continue to exercise discretion. Now, on this particular point that you've raised, we will make sure that this is covered in the guidance as well. But I would expect local authorities to use their discretion, and obviously if we come across some evidence that it isn't working, then the guidance will be kept under review and we can amend.
Thank you very much for that. I'm still a little bit concerned about this, because I do believe there is a risk that local authorities are effectively incentivised to perhaps not exempt such properties because of the additional income tax income that they might have from generating these particular types of policies. So what will the Cabinet Secretary propose to try and mitigate this?
Well, I think what Fiona's just outlined will build on the existing discretionary powers that local authorities have, and to take account of individual circumstances and individual circumstances within their local authority area that may be particular to that local authority. So the issue of seasonal workers has been mentioned. There may be others. And we would expect local authorities to use their discretionary powers. We will pick that up and make sure it is referenced specifically in the guidance if it's not already. And again, as Fiona said, we'll monitor the situation. So if we are in a position where we feel that a local authority is not using its discretionary powers in a way that is appropriate for something like the specific case that Megan Gallagher raises, then we have the opportunity to strengthen the statutory guidance. And statutory guidance is exactly that. It's guidance on statutory footing. So it is, it has to be taken account of by the local authority. It's not something that can just be set aside. So I think with all of that, I would give those assurances to Megan Gallagher that those safeguards will be there for those particular circumstances.
That's helpful to know, Cabinet Secretary. And finally, you mentioned earlier on that you are hoping to incentivise to turn short-term lets perhaps into more longer-term tenancies. However, measures being brought in by this Scottish Government, particularly over this parliamentary term, will not incentivise particularly people to enter the private rented sector in order to bring these homes in to actually create those longer term rental properties. So what is the government's overall strategy here? Because if they continue to decentivise the private rented sector, they're not going to have the desired outcome that they're proposing through this particular measure.
Well, I mean, I don't accept the characterisation of disincentivising private sector. There is a very healthy private rented sector in Scotland with growth continuing, and there is renewed interest from major investors in areas like mid-market rent, build-to-rent. So, and those will be important components of the expansion and of affordable housing. The £4.9 billion of investment over the piece, £800 million of that will be from private investors, and there is a lot of interest from that market. So I don't accept that characterisation. I think what we want to see is horses for courses. So in some areas of Scotland, there is not the same pressure around second homes, and therefore the local authority will want to look at its own housing market. In some areas, though, there is huge pressure around second homes where local people, young people in those areas cannot remain because they cannot get access to a property, whether to purchase one or to rent one. And this is really trying to empower local authorities to be able to create their own regulatory environment that suits the needs of that area. So it's not one size fits all here at all. In addition, we have taken action around empty homes through the funding of the Empty Home Partnership. That has seen an investment of about £5.7 million since 2010. It's helped to bring almost 13,000 homes back into use. And again, in 24-25, a record over 2,000 privately owned empty homes were returned to active use, 10% more than the year before. So we are wanting to work with owners of second properties. We don't want them sitting empty. So we're trying across a range of policy areas to encourage those homes to be brought back into use, because that benefits everybody. So there's not, but I emphasise it's not one size fits all here. We want to empower local authorities to use their powers in a constructive way.
Thank you, convener.
Just before we go into the formal consideration of the motion, I just wanted to, and it's a little bit broader, but it's kind of connected to what you've been saying in terms of bringing houses back into the market to create homes for people. And I think this is broader than the regulations, but there's a circumstance in rural Highland, a Highland village, where a second home came back onto the market at £400,000. And we were, one of the things we're trying to do is have local people be able to afford to live in the village that they want to, or come back to live there. But at £400,000 for, a second home coming back into the market, I think that's something to do with an inflated housing market, and that's a bigger issue than this regulation. But I think that's something that we need to recognise as a Parliament and a government, that this regulation is part of the picture, but there is a bigger issue around the actual housing market in rural Scotland.
Yeah, and the growth in the cost of homes in some parts of Scotland has risen exponentially, particularly since COVID, and we understand all of the reasons why. I think that's why the investment in the Affordable Housing Supply Programme is so critical. So, over £900 million to be invested in 26-27 through this budget in the Affordable Housing Supply Programme. That is a record investment, £4.9 billion over the spending review period, and that has been clearly prioritised where capital is in short supply. We have absolutely prioritised affordable housing. Now, we want to work with some of the community housing providers who, with very small numbers of affordable homes, can make such a difference in some of the villages in the Highlands and Islands, where you may have single number of new homes being built, but transformational for that community. And the community housing organisations, I think, do a tremendous job at being able to navigate some quite tricky things around land ownership, around crofting, and managing to find land availability to take forward these projects. So it's not all about massive house building programmes in urban Scotland. Some of it is about these small scale but crucial developments in some of our smaller communities.
Great, thanks. That's great to have your and the government's recognition of that important work. And I think there's a pipeline of 1,700 houses that we could potentially build in the rural areas. I'm now going to move on to formal consideration of the motion, but I'm just also just got the news that Fulton McGregor has given his apologies for the meeting. So we now turn to agenda item 3, which is formal consideration of motion S6M 20608, and the motion calls for the committee to recommend approval of the draft council tax variation for unoccupied dwellings, Scotland Amendment Regulation 2026, and I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motion.
Just formally move.
Thank you. And any contributions from members? No. This is just a formal part of my script. I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to sum up and respond to the debate.
I think there's nothing more I would like to add, Convener. Thanks.
The question is that motion S6M 20608 in the name of Shona Robison is approved. Are we all agreed? We're agreed. Okay. Thank you. Megan, can I just check? Are you agreed? No? Okay, we're not agreed. Went a bit too quickly there. Okay, we're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of the motion? All those against? Megan, all those against? Maybe she's abstaining. Oh, she's okay. Abstentions? No, he was waiting to see. Yeah. So he's abstaining. So 4 against, 2 abstentions. Okay. The result of the division on motion S6M 20608 is 4 for and 0 against and 2 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. Okay, thank you. Following consideration of the instrument, members are invited to decide how they'd like to proceed with the report. Would members like to consider a draft report in private at our meeting next week, or are you content to delegate to me the responsibility to approve the report for publication? Content to delegate. Okay, great. Thank you. That concludes our formal consideration of the instrument, and I'm now going to briefly suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses. Thanks very much. to take evidence on the draft private housing rent control exempt property Scotland Regulations 2026, and we are joined by the Cabinet Secretary for Housing, Mary McCallan, MSP, who's accompanied by her officials, Sean Cassidy, who's the rent control team leader, and Craig McGuffey, who's a solicitor, and I welcome you all to the meeting. This instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve it before it comes into force. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider a motion to approve the instrument. And I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate on the instrument that follows. And there's no need for you to operate your microphones. We'll do that for you. And I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement.
Committee, and thank you for the opportunity to give evidence on the regulations this morning. The Housing Scotland Act 2025 introduced a long-term system of rent controls for Scotland. It's essential in our view that these protections are in place for tenants and that they are balanced in respect of landlords' property rights. And finally, it's important that they also support continued investment in new long-term rented homes. In a housing emergency, our view is that we must increase the availability and, in turn, the affordability of rented housing in Scotland. So as a government, we've worked hard to get this balance right. During the passage of the bill, we engaged with MSPs across parties. We carried out a full public consultation to gather views on how to create the right exemptions from rent controls. And our Housing Investment Task Force also considered how exemptions could support future investment in rented housing. Since the Act was passed, we've continued to engage with stakeholders, including local authorities, the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, the Housing Investment Task Force and landlord and tenant representative groups. And we have now set out these exemptions with the intention of providing clarity, addressing reported barriers to investment in new rented housing and maintaining the attractiveness of Scotland as a place to invest. So a touch of detail, Convener. The proposed exemption for mid-market rent will apply only in cases where a restriction on rent increases is already in place. This could be where public funding creates a direct or indirect restriction on increasing the rent, or where the terms of the tenancy speak to such a restriction. Our view is that layering additional rent control measures atop of this would provide unnecessary complexity and not actually bring any benefits to the tenants. So whether the restriction is in place via funding or via the tenancy agreement, rent increases for the property must be limited to a specified level. The exemption requires that rents remain at or below the median for properties of a comparable size in that broad rental market area, and this is published on an annual basis by the Scottish Government. And where the landlord fails to keep their rents below this level, they will no longer qualify for exemption from rent control. Moving to the exemption for build-to-rent properties, this is aimed at supporting much-needed investment in new purpose-built homes for rent and the retention of these homes in the rented sector. Under this exemption, groups of 6 or more residential properties sharing the same planning permission and owned by the same person or group, which were constructed after the date of the announcement, these will be exempt. As well as new builds, properties that have been converted for residential use and derelict properties returned to use will be included. And this exemption will no longer apply where the nature or use of the property is changed. For example, if it is used as a short-term let or occupied by the owner, then it would no longer be eligible for exemption. And this is about helping to ensure that the exemption acts to support that long-term supply of rented homes. Landlords of exempt properties in rent control areas will need to confirm their exempt status. We're working to ensure this administrative process is smooth and that tenants know whether a property is exempt and understand their rights in this circumstances, and the verification process for this will be set out in due course. So just in summary, Convener, the regulations being considered today will remove the perceived barriers to investment in both mid-market and build-to-rent properties, supporting future investment and helping to ensure that strong supply of rented properties. Most importantly, I feel they strike the right balance between tenant protection and landlords' property rights. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. And we're going to turn to a few questions that we have. And I'd be interested to hear, you mentioned the housing emergency and the importance of ensuring affordability of housing options. I'd be interested to hear from you how the introduction of exemptions to rent controls would sit with the Scottish Government's plans to tackle the emergency.
Well, thank you, Convener. The emergency is multifaceted, and it requires us to take different actions across the board, one of which, of course, was rent control itself, which was about protecting tenants from exorbitant rent increases. But an equally important part of tackling the emergency is ensuring that there is investment in our housing sector. And I need that not only because more investment means more properties, means more choice and can drive down price, but also I need investment because I need the whole sector base to grow so that we can deliver the all-tenure properties that we need and so that we can deliver the affordable properties that we need. So these exemptions are, we shouldn't forget, you know, rent control across the country is the baseline here, but these exemptions are in place to offer clarity and to create those conditions for confidence and for growth that we believe we need to have enough rental homes and to drive up availability and drive down costs.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Just something that came up at our evidence session, which you may have been across last week, is concerns around MMR tenants and their ability to contest rent increases. That was raised by Living Rent, where there's situations where MMR tenants are now seeing 50% rent increases. Are you aware of that, and what mechanisms would be available to tenants to contest those increases?
Thank you, Convener. Sorry, did you say mid-market rent?
Yes.
Yes. So a couple of points on that. The first one is to say that these exemptions will only apply so long as the cost restrictions set out for mid-market rent, be that because of public money or because of the tenancy agreement, the exemptions will only apply so long as those are met. So where rent increases were made and that took it out with the rules of the agreement, this exemption would no longer apply. And rent controls could therefore operate, and those tenants might find themselves within a rent control zone with rent capped at CPI plus 1%. I think the other point to make is that the rent adjudication service will also apply regardless of these exemptions, both to mid-market and build-to-rent tenants. And it's worth noting, I think, that the Housing Act, if I can remember correctly, the timescales, it extended the time in which a tenant can raise the question of rent adjudication, I think from 21 to 30 days, Sean is nodding. And we also made changes so that the rent adjudication service could not set the rate above that which was recommended by the landlord. So I suppose to answer your question, they're protected by the terms of the exemption for mid-market rent in the first instance. They then have the rent adjudication process to help them as well, and the Housing Act has strengthened that rent adjudication process.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess the thing that I came across when we were doing the work on the actual housing, what is now an act, which is good news, is the challenge for some people who are in rented accommodation to actually go through that process, to even start it. And you know, what we need is a kind of landscape where it's just easier for them. It's their home, and to kind of like move into that kind of adversarial space can be challenging. So I think I just want to note that. And I'm going to move on and bring in Alexander Stewart with a question.
Thank you very much, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you've outlined the process and the procedures that will take place, but maybe if I can ask how the impact of these exemptions on tenants will be kept under review, because I think the importance of keeping the review process and how that's managed and how that's captured is also quite important in this process.
Yes, absolutely. And it is very much our intention to monitor the impact of this, as we will monitor the impact of the Act as a whole. And we have some core ways of doing that. One is that the whole function of rent control will require us to collect rents on a widespread basis across Scotland. So we will be able to, once that is up and running, we will be able to observe any trends there and respond if need be. We also have, I suppose, a suite of national statistics which help us to do that as well on house building, on homelessness and others. So we will keep a really close eye on that. I mean, my view And it goes back to what the convener was saying. One of the most important ways to empower tenants and to keep matters under review is to make sure that when a tenant is looking at a prospective property, they understand whether it's exempt or whether it's subject to rent control, and we also make provision for that in the Act as well. So knowing in advance and then going into it, understanding your rights, including to rent adjudication, and then the government monitoring really carefully the impact that this has. But I would just restate that I think it's absolutely the right thing for now. We need, supply and demand are very much out of kilter, and we need to address that, and this is going to help us do that. But these are made by regulation, so they can be reviewed in future.
Thank you, Convener.
And we're now going to move on to questions around Build to Rent, and I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher, who's joining us online.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and officials. You touched upon the exemption will apply to buildings of more than 6 units, excuse me, and I'm just wondering how the Scottish Government took account of the differences between urban and rural settings when arriving at this definition.
Thank you, Ms Gallagher. So our objective here was to act swiftly to restore confidence in investment and to seek to do that with the clearest, most straightforward regulatory provisions that we could. But one of the challenges within that was defining build to rent. And it's quite right that to be asked the extent to which both urban and rural circumstances were considered. The 6 property limit is not only tied to the LBTT regime in Scotland, but I think it also reflects rural requirements, because when many of us think about build to rent, we will think of inner city projects of hundreds of units, but making the limit 6 and therefore quite small in comparison is about trying to capture rural needs as well as being aligned with the LBTT system. So I was looking through some of the evidence that the committee had heard, and I know that Scottish Land and Estates, I think, forgive me if it wasn't them that raised that, but had asked, had wanted it perhaps to be a little lower. But I think 6 strikes the right balance between what we traditionally think of as build to rent, but also quite a low number to capture rural developments as well.
That's helpful. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary and Convener.
Thanks. And I'm now going to bring in Willie Coffey.
Thanks, Convener. It's really a follow-on question from that, Cabinet Secretary.
Yep.
About what protections are there for people from facing unlimited rent increases in the BTR if it is less than 6 units? I know you've said it's a fair level, having looked at all the data that you have, but does that mean that people are at risk of unlimited rent increases below that level in the BTR?
Thank you. So the terms of the exemption will protect people in the first instance. You're quite right, Mr Coffey, to mention 6 units, but also that point about being continually let. If it moves to a short-term let, it comes out with the exemption. If the occupier moves in, if it's sold, no longer exempt. So all of that exists to protect the tenant. But so does what I referred to the convener earlier in respect of rent adjudication, because that will still be available to a build-to-rent tenant, albeit they might not be in, they will not be within rent controls. They will still be able to challenge a rent if they feel it's above the open market value. The rent adjudication system will consider that. They'll have longer to do that on account of the new powers in the 2025 Act. And we've also addressed the fact that the adjudication service could no longer set it or recommend that it be set above that which the landlord had recommended. So, albeit out with rent control, so long as the conditions are met for the exemption, they will still have access to the rent adjudication service.
Okay, thank you.
And Evelyn Tweed.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Thanks for your answers so far. Cabinet Secretary, will build-to-rent properties remain defined as such in perpetuity?
So I have no plans to change the definition of build-to-rent for this exemption. I think, as I said earlier, I think this is the right response just now, whilst we're in housing emergency, whilst we need to significantly increase supply. So I have no plans. Obviously, we're at the end of a parliamentary term and therefore a new government will be coming in. But as far as I'm concerned, this doesn't change, and we, the committee will have heard, I think, about the time periods for build to rent. I chose not to put a time limit on that because I think right now, with the situation that we all face in Scotland, we need to be creating as much long-term certainty as we can for the investment sector. Not just so that build to rent grows, but so that all tenures grow. Because, as you know, Ms Tweed, we need that contractor base, we need the whole of the housing sector's capacity to build so that we can have all tenure, but crucially we can get that 70% of social properties built before our next target time limit. So right now this is the right thing and I don't have any intention of changing it.
We did hear some concerns about a two-tier private rental system being created. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that the way we've framed this is just to try and respond to the fact that there are different types of rental offer. So not in any way intending to create two-tier systems in any way, but simply reflecting that these are different rental offers. So I think that, as I say, build to rent is a particular type of investment that requires a long-term return. And if we want to encourage it in Scotland, which we do, we need to make sure the conditions are right. Equally, mid-market rent is a really important affordable offer, already subject to rent control in a sense, because you know it is mid-market rent by the fact that the rent is controlled. So not about two-tier by any means, but just about having conditions that are right for the particular type of rental offer that we're talking about, which means that maybe they have to be treated differently, but not two-tier.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Thanks. Just to clarify what we're talking about here, so when we ask these questions about build-to-rent properties or MMR, we're talking about the exemption within a rent-controlled area. So a local authority will create a rent-controlled area, and within that we're going to exempt MMR and build-to-rent. But there's nothing to stop MMR or build-to-rent happening somewhere else in the city or the council area. So, yeah.
Yes, but there ought to be nothing to stop them anywhere. And I think that's the point. We want to, because when investment decisions are being made with the prospect of a long-term return, particularly for build-to-rent, but also for mid-market rent, I want investors in those properties to know that because they have this exemption in law, they can have confidence that they're not going to be subject to rent controls, even if one is to arise in the area that they're operating in. So it's about saying from the outset, you can have confidence, you can make your investment decisions, you can invest in Scotland, and you can know that within the parameters of these rules, you won't be subject to rent control.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much for that. We are now going to turn to agenda item 5, which is the formal consideration of motion S6M 20617. The motion calls for the committee to recommend approval of the draft private housing rent control exempt property Scotland Regulations 2026. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move this motion.
Thank you, Convener. Motion is moved.
Thank you. And I now invite contributions from members. Okay, I've got a contribution, so bear with me. So Scottish Greens oppose exemptions from rent controls. To work for renters and landlords, the system needs to be simple and transparent. There shouldn't be wiggle room for landlords, and tenants should have a clear idea of what their rights are. In terms of build to rent, it's seen by many as a way to increase private investment in housing supply, but is only attractive to investors if they can be sure of high rent yields. So it tends to be high-end luxury housing, or at least priced at the higher end of the spectrum. And such developments don't sit well with the desire for mixed communities or for an affordable element of large-scale housing developments. And there's no reason in principle why a BTR tenant shouldn't have the same package of tenancy protections. The argument for exemptions only holds if BTR is seen as a positive form of housing development compared with other types. And at the moment, the Scottish Greens don't think that is the case. In terms of MMR, during the passage of the Housing Act, we also didn't agree with them, and I think that position is potentially changing, but because the two, based on the evidence that we've heard from various stakeholders, but because the two are within the same piece of secondary legislation, I'm going to have to vote against the legislation as a whole. Okay. I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to sum up and respond to the debate.
Thank you, Convener. I won't say too much more except to thank you for your comments. And I would only close by saying this is a response to the larger piece of work, which is about a national system of rent controls. And this is a discrete bit of regulation which is about trying to offer the best balance between tenant protection and landlords' rights, but crucially investment and growth in Scotland's housing sector, which I think is critical if we are to rebalance supply and demand, which is requiring rebalancing just now.
Thanks very much for that. The question is that motion S6M 20617 in the name of Mary McCallan be approved. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. All those in favour of the motion? All those against? Any abstentions? And the result of the division on the motion S6M 20617 is 5 for and 1 against. The motion has been agreed. Thank you for that. Following consideration of the instrument, members are invited to decide how we would like to proceed with a report. Would members like to consider a draft report in private at our meeting next week, or are you content to delegate responsibility to me to approve the report for publication? Content to delegate to me. Thank you. And that concludes our formal consideration of this instrument, and I'll now briefly suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you very much. Hang on a minute. Yeah. Okay. Okay. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence on 2 affirmative instruments. The first is the draft first-tier tribunal for Scotland, local taxation chamber and upper tribunal for Scotland, composition and rules of procedure miscellaneous amendment regulations 2026, and the draft first-tier tribunal for Scotland, allocations of functions to the local taxation chamber regulations 2026. And we're joined by the Minister for Public Finance, Ivan McKee, MSP, who's accompanied by his officials, David Story, who's the head of local taxation policy, Susan Robb, who's the solicitor, and Rachel Curry, who is the local taxation policy manager. And I welcome you all to the meeting. These instruments are laid under the affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve them before they come into force. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider motions to approve the instruments. And I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debates on the instruments that follow. There's no need for you to operate your microphones. We'll do that for you. And I now invite the Minister to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, and I'm grateful to the Committee for its careful consideration of the Visitor Levy Amendment Bill and associated affirmative regulations, 2 of which are being formally considered this morning. The purpose of these regulations is to ensure that visitor levy appeals, as and when they arise, can be heard and determined effectively within the Scottish Tribunal structure. The composition and rules of procedure regulations amend tribunal composition and procedural rules to allow for effective administration of visitor levy appeals. With regards to composition, the regulations allow for a legal member to sit alone or a legal member to sit with one other member, depending on the complexity of the case being heard. This allows the President of Scottish Tribunals or the Chamber President, as appropriate, to adopt a proportionate approach and make best use of available resources when determining composition. With regards to rules of procedure, the regulations insert a new part to help ensure clarity, consistency and accessibility for visitor levy appeals. This provides a clear procedural route for appellants and local authorities, setting out the required contents of a notice of appeal, acknowledgement requirements, withdrawal rules, the Tribunal's order-making powers and permission to appeal procedure. The regulations also provide a tailored procedural framework for appeals to the upper tribunal arising from visitor levy cases. The allocation of funds to local taxation chamber regulations allocate responsibility for determining visitor level appeals to the local taxation chamber of the first tier tribunal for Scotland. Such appeals have been allocated to the local taxation chamber because they are anticipated to be aligned with the chamber's existing work and expertise. In relation to both sets of regulation, the Scottish Government consulted with the President of Scottish Tribunals, Lady Wise, and the Lord President as required. I'm grateful for their thoughtful feedback, which the Scottish Government has taken on board in full in the development of the regulations as laid. Finally, I understand that the DPLRC considered these regulations on 17 February and no points were raised. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have with regard to both sets of regulations. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. We do have a number of questions. I'm going to start with a few questions around detail. I'm going to actually just combine them. So this is around, I'd be interested to understand if accommodation providers will be required to pay a fee for any appeals they submit. And I would also be interested to get a sense from you if they are able to use the review and appeals process to challenge the basis on which the levy is charged. For example, if they would prefer a fixed amount rather than a percentage.
Well, in terms of the second question, that would obviously be set by the local authority. So I'm pretty sure there wouldn't be any scope for businesses to appeal on the basis of charge. On the fee structure, if you want to cover that. Who wants to cover that?
They can challenge, the accommodation providers would be able to challenge the operation of the visitor levy scheme, but I don't imagine that would encompass the fee structure. No.
Okay, I'm just going to clarify. So are they going to be required to pay a fee if they appeal?
No, that's just not. Sorry.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. And I know on the second point around changing the fixed amount, I would hope that the local authorities consulted well enough to understand the right rate, whether it's a percentage or a flat rate?
Well, I mean, the local authority will make that through their consultation, but clearly you may well be in a situation where not all businesses would necessarily agree with the decisions made by the local authority, but that would be the process.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I'm now going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, as you're aware, we heard, and you did too, hear from Tuda's representations about the per night, per person limit levy would be unworkable. That was very much their case. So if a local authority decides to introduce such a scheme, how many reviews and appeals does the Scottish Government expect would result from this?
So there's a few different things there, and obviously not in relation to this regulation, but the government, the government has taken forward amendments at stage 2, which would remove the per person per night provision, and those have been lodged. So I suppose in that sense that question is perhaps moot.
If it's helpful, I can perhaps shed a bit of further light. It's difficult to anticipate full caseload, as there's never been clearly something quite like this. This is a new addition to the Chamber. We have worked with the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service to estimate costs. So the costs are estimated to be between £150,000 to £300,000. Now that's on a low amount to a high amount. Clearly, there may have been, had there been a per person per night, a greater increase in people challenging on the basis of more dissatisfaction might lead to greater caseload. So I think that will possibly help to diminish some of the potential disgruntled appeals, though perhaps not entirely. I think the other thing in terms of the first year, if you're looking at in terms of estimating caseloads, the first year, of course, Edinburgh is the first scheme to come online in July 2026, in July this year. That will be, of course, part of the way through a financial year. You then need a quarter before the first returns happen, and then there will need to be cases lodged and then processed through the chamber. So that in the first financial year, there will be a relatively small number of cases, I would anticipate. That will, of course, grow not only as Edinburgh fully comes online with a full financial year, but as Glasgow and others come online. So I think that is something that we will need to keep monitoring, and it would be something I would anticipate would also be covered within the statutory 3-year review and report to Parliament as to how these things are going.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. I'm now going to bring in Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister and your colleagues. In terms of the appeal process, is it possible that accommodation providers and others could appeal the purpose to which a local authority wishes to spend the visitor levy? Because the wording in the regulations say that the appeals process relates to the decisions of the local authority relating to the operation of the visitor scheme in its entirety. So does that stretch out into the purpose and intention as to what they do with the visitor levy receipts or not?
That is a good question. Officials are telling me no. I don't know if they want to reflect on that. Or do we want to go and consider that and come back? David?
So no would be the answer. So if you're thinking about the purpose of the tribunal clearly is there in terms of a matter of what is being charged and what is liable. The liability would not be something that would come into that particular kind of issue. There will, of course, be other mechanisms in order to dispute. So local authorities will have a forum for businesses and for the community to engage and to raise those kind of issues. But an individual business raising an issue about that, I don't think would be an appropriate mechanism. Ultimately, it will be for the Chamber to consider whether or not, of course, the scope of the appeals which they receive. So it wouldn't be for me to say that someone will not put in an appeal and try, but it would be for the individual tribunal to consider whether it met the scope of what they are looking at and for that to work its way through the due process. But I would anticipate that would fall within the jurisdiction, no.
Okay, thanks for that, David. Thank you.
Maybe something worth keeping an eye on and seeing if something like that emerges. I'm now going to bring in Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister and officials. Thanks for your answers so far. In terms of the number of appeals going to the local taxation chamber, do we feel that, you know, we've looked at resources, financial implications? Do we have an idea of what that will look like?
Well, there is estimates being made. Now, clearly, as this moves forward, data will become clearer as it's rolled out across different local authorities potentially. And of course, you would expect in the settling down period there may be more going through, and that may settle down as the process becomes embedded. But as has been indicated, we've made some assessments in terms of what the range of costs may be in that 150 to 300 to 300,000 range as the initial expectation. But of course, that will be monitored as we move forward.
And Mark Griffin.
Good morning, Minister. In the original 2023 bill, the financial memorandum said that the Scottish Government would engage with stakeholders when it came to the cost of the regulations. So just to ask what engagement the Government's had with local authorities and tourism bodies or operators as to the cost of the appeal process for them.
Well, there's been engagement as part of this process, and also we've arrived at those numbers we're talking about. But the funding mechanism for that is that government would effectively fund that, the cost of the tribunal. So that's it. But in terms of the specific engagement,
so in terms of the costs of running the tribunal, that will be met by government. In terms of the costs of taking a case or defending it from a local authority perspective, that would be something that would be covered by the local authority, and that would be something which they take out of their administration costs for the levy. We have engaged primarily with the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, both in terms of costing from the government side and in terms of ensuring that the caseload is anticipated and worked through from their side.
Okay, thanks. The other question I had was on the potential clash. You know, we might expect a high volume of appeals when it comes to non-domestic rates and the revaluation exercise that's ongoing just now. Just wonder, particularly in Edinburgh, with Edinburgh taking forward their scheme earlier than other areas, whether there's a potential for a high volume of claims on NDR clashing with potential claims in Edinburgh on the visitor levy, and whether the courts and tribunal system are, you know, adequately resourced to cover a particular pinch point like that.
Well, I mean, there's obviously ongoing processes to deal with that, and the size of the capacity of the system will be sized to deal with that. We've obviously looked at this incrementally in terms of what may happen with regards to visitor levy appeals and with regards to other appeals going through the system, be it NDR or other appeals. Those considerations will be taken into account because it's not the first time we've done a revaluation, so there'll be knowledge and expertise in terms of what impact that may have on the overall system as it moves forward. So I suppose the question is both of those will be considered separately, but the cumulative effect will have been considered as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And just in the area of reviews and appeals between now, I'd be interested to understand if there are more regulations that might be likely to be issued between now and the first scheme coming into operation, and also whether updated guidance on appeals, on the appeals process is now required.
So, all officials talk to these regulations that are coming forward, but clearly there's regulations in terms of the original Act, and then follow on potentially with regards to the Amendment Act, the Amendment Bill that's going through at the moment.
In terms of regulations, all of the sorry, I'm searching for the word, my mind's just gone blank. In terms of the instruments, we have laid all the instruments for both the bill. This is obviously relating to the original 2024 Visitor Levy Act. This is the last aspect of ensuring that enforcement can be of the original act can be taken forward, and we have no further things to sort of lodge with the committee going forward. So this is the last of the, I suppose, the batch of things to enact the original act.
Okay, good.
In terms of the bill, the amendment bill, there will be further regulations potentially, but those will come obviously in the next session of Parliament.
Yes, yeah, indeed. Sorry, yeah, I see what you mean. Yes, there will be, further enactment.
More,
of the,
yes.
of the new
the amendment bill, yeah. Okay, and then just I asked about a need potentially to update guidance on the appeals process. Is that now required, or do you find that the guidance is fine?
It's something that we will look at. We have, of course, statutory guidance that we have through Visit Scotland. That guidance will need to be updated in line with where Parliament takes the Visitor Levy Amendment Act. We will consider that in the round. The guidance is currently there. It's published. It's in the public domain. We will consider that at the end of the, or as we go through the bill process, as to what tweaks and improvements we can make. We've already on the second iteration, so it's not something that we're just doing for the bill. We will keep updating it as and when required.
Right. Okay. Great. Thanks very much for that evidence. We're now going to turn to agenda item 7, which is the formal consideration of two motions. The first is motion S6M 20735, which calls for the committee to recommend approval of the draft first-tier tribunal for Scotland, local taxation chamber and upper tribunal for Scotland, composition and rules of procedure, miscellaneous amendment regulations 2026. And I invite the Minister to speak to and move this motion.
Moved.
Do any members wish to contribute? Okay. The question is that motion S6M 20735 in the name of Ivan McKee be approved. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. Thank you. We now move to the second motion, S6M 20734, which calls for the committee to recommend approval of the draft first-tier tribunal for Scotland, allocations of functions to the Local Taxation Chamber Regulations 2026. And I invite the Minister to speak to and move this motion.
Moved.
Do any members wish to contribute? The question is that motion S6M 20734 in the name of Ivan McKee be approved. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. Thank you. Following consideration of these instruments, members are invited to decide how they'd like to proceed with the report. Would members like to consider a draft report in private at our meeting next week, or are you content to delegate responsibility to me to approve it for publication? Content to delegate to me. Thank you. And that concludes our formal consideration of these instruments, and I'll now briefly suspend the meeting to allow witnesses to leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you next week, I believe.
For more. We now turn to agenda item 8, which is the formal consideration of 3 negative instruments. The Town and Country Planning Fees for Appeals Scotland Amendment Regulations 2026, SSI 2026/47, the Town and Country Planning Fees for Local Reviews Scotland Amendment Regulations 2026, SSI 2026/48, and the Town and Country Planning Fees for Applications Scotland Amendment Regulations 2026, SSI 2026/49. Do members have any comments on these instruments? Is the committee agreed? No member has any comments. Is the committee agreed that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to these instruments? And that concludes our public part of the meeting, and we will move into private.